Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my definitive review of the Canon RF 70-200mm F2.8L IS. This is their pro-grade telephoto zoom, and it joins the 15-35mm and 24-70mm F2.8 lenses as being the kind of trinity of their professional grade zooms for the new Canon RF mount, which is their full-frame mirrorless systems. So I've actually done this review on the new EOS R5. It's a great lens to kind of get some of the potential of the sports tracking action out of this particular camera. This is obviously an incredibly important lens because it is one of the top choices that professionals that do a lot of things will choose to use, and of course also amateurs that have a little bit deeper pockets, as we'll get to in just a moment. But it is a lens that is incredibly useful for weddings, for portraits, for events, even for sideline sports, for venues that are smaller, basketball, for example. And so this is obviously an incredibly important lens to establish Canon's RF system, or RF mount, and EOS R cameras as being, viable upgrades for those that have been, Canon's EF shooters in the past that are looking and considering mirrorless moving ahead. And so what we have got here is actually a unique approach to this particular focal length for Canon. You could pretty much predict how they're going to work out in the past. They've gone through many generations of lenses at this particular focal length or near to it, and they've all basically followed the same rough formula. And even when it comes to the stabilized version on the EF mount, they were up to Mark III before moving towards the RF system. But what we have got this time is that rather than a larger, heavier, internally zooming lens, we have got an externally zooming lens that is about 30% shorter, it's about 30% lighter, and it's about 30% more expensive. So apparently Canon's calculus is that the smaller the lens, the bigger the price. But of course, this lens is one that a lot of you are probably considering if you've moved to Canon's EOS R systems. And so I want to give you my definitive review today that will give you hopefully all the information you need to make an informed buying decision about this particular lens. Now, if you prefer your reviews to be shorter and less detailed, I recommend that you check out the standard review instead.
Today's episode is brought to you by Lens Racks, a camera gear storage system that allows you to make quick changes to your equipment. The aluminum rails and the proprietary mounts allow you to safely and effectively store your precious lenses, cameras, flashes, and more without concern of them tipping over or being damaged. You can quickly select a lens, give a twist, and be on your way, and yet the whole system is stable enough to stand up vertically. It's a great system if you want to store your gear in a drawer, out of sight and protected from the elements. For more information, visit store.lensracks.com and use coupon code DUSTIN15 for 15% off your purchase.
Now we're going to start off today by taking a look at the build, the features, and of course the redesign that is here. And so let's jump in and let's take a closer look hands-on at this particular lens.
The Canon lens is every bit as short. It's actually a couple millimeters shorter than what the Tamron lens, but we've obviously got a big difference in the diameter. Diameter of the Canon lens, 90 millimeters compared to 81 millimeters. And so obviously some significant difference. Now, all things being equal, of course, the Canon lens here is not the Tamron. We've got the full 70-200 millimeters of focal length. We have got an image stabilizer built in. We've got obviously a more robust build and feature set than what we have got in the Tamron. Now, one thing that's entirely similar is that if you look at the back of the lens, you can see there is a glass element right towards the back of the lens, which means that in this case, you will not be able to use a teleconverter or extender. There is no physical room to mount one, and so this is a lens that is designed solely for use with the bare lens. And so that is one definite disadvantage compared to Canon's 70-200mm f2.8 lenses for EF mount, is that you have no teleconverter option here. Now, beyond this, in terms of physical dimensions, just give you the quick dimensions, we have got, as I've noted, about 90 millimeters in diameter, or 3.54 inches. Overall length is 146 millimeters, or 5.75 inches. And so obviously that's a huge difference, 146 millimeters compared to about 200 millimeters for the latest EF version of this lens. Difference being, of course, is that that lens is an internally zooming lens. This lens does extend significantly when you are zooming out. At the same time, however, there's a lot of people that are immediately paranoid whenever any kind of lens extends when zooming, and they think immediately it's going to be a dust magnet and going to just fill right up with dust. To me, the kind of best comparison point for this particular lens is actually Canon's 70-200mm L series lens. It reminds me of it a lot. It's similarly squat, thick around, and really, really well built. But also that lens too was a lens that extended while zooming, much like this. And I owned that lens for years. I did not have a dust problem with it. If a lens is well sealed, which this lens is, even if you do have some pump action there, it doesn't automatically mean that dust is going to get into the lens. And I don't believe that's going to be the case with this particular lens that does show a good degree of weather sealing. But there's no doubt that it does extend considerably here, and it has a really, really robust lens hood. Like it's very thick around, it's quite long, and so when you're fully extended out, you're going to definitely have what becomes a much more significantly sized lens. This lens hood does have a locking mechanism. It also has this port that allows you to rotate a circular polarizer. This tends to be somewhat divisive amongst people. I can't say that I often make use of it myself. I've owned several lenses and own a lens that has it. And so, of course, your mileage may vary with all of that as to whether or not it's valuable. The one downside I will point to such a wide lens hood is that this particular lens, once you have the lens hood reversed for storage, it has a very, very wide footprint as far as the space it's going to take up in your bag. And so what I'm actually finding myself doing is that a lot of times when I'm going out for a quick shoot, I'm taking it without the hood. And so, just a design quirk that, may or may not be the case for you. We've got the pretty typical 77mm front filter thread up front. The overall weight here is 1,070 grams or 2.35 pounds. That is significantly lighter than the 70-200L Mark III that weighs in at 1,480 grams, which by the way is the exact same weight as the Sony FE 70-200 G Master lens. And so we have got a significant weight savings here. The lens does come with a tripod collar, which is I like the design here because it is completely removable. It also is, it's just fairly easy to use in terms of operation, not hard to remove. In some cases, I find that some 70-200 designs are really complicated to actually get the tripod collar removed. That's not the case here. Once you get it to the place where it's been loosened up enough, you just have to separate the two pieces and off it comes. I have only one real criticism of tripod collar, and it's this: it is not Arca-Swiss compatible. There's no ridging there, and so you're going to have to put a quick release plate on there. Honestly, I have no idea why they would not just groove this and make it Arca-Swiss. It makes zero sense to me. Frankly, I think it's stupid, but anyway, it is what it is. The lens itself is 17 elements in 13 groups. You can focus down to 70 centimeters, that's 2.3 feet, and you have a very useful 0.23 times of magnification. That is a little bit better than the L Mark III, 0.21 times, not quite as good as the Sony 70-200 that is 0.25 times, but overall physically we've got a very, very nice, howbeit expensive lens.
So as I noted in that section, I think that what really stands out to me is the similarity in feel and operation to that of the 70-200mm F 4 to 5.6 LIS. In a lot of ways, this lens follows that formula a little bit more closely in that it feels very similar in terms of the weight distribution and the robustness of the build, but and in kind of the overall dimensions, it feels quite similar. And I think that's a positive thing. I really liked the 70-300L, and it was a lens that I got a lot of great photos with, and I just found the form factor to actually be usable for traveling. I've taken it to countries around the world. And I was able to just pack smaller and lighter than what I could with a typically sized 70-200 F2.8 lens, and obviously that is the case here as well. So great build, great size, a lot of pros there. My only kind of principal criticisms when it comes to the build and the feature set is that number one, this lens, unlike any of Canon's previous 70-200 options, precludes the use of teleconverters. And so that is going to be a limiting factor for some people who are making this investment and hoping to kind of double up and being able to also get a little bit of longer telephoto use out of it. You don't have that same flexibility here. And so that could be a major liability. On the much lower scale, I do really miss having ARCA compatibility on the tripod foot. Now you can see right now I'm using the lens without it, and frankly if I owned this lens I would use the tripod foot only when I was working from a tripod and probably doing formal tests. Most of the time this is the configuration that you would see, and in fact if I'm traveling light, this is probably the configuration that you would see because the lens hood is it's big comparatively to the size of the basic lens itself. So let's talk about the stabilization a bit more for a second. Canon rates this, or SEPA rates it at 5 stops, which is obviously that makes it good. But then when you pair it with the EOS R5 or R6 in-body image stabilization, Canon claims that you get a combined stabilization of about 7.5 stops, which of course is incredibly impressive, at least on paper. So how does it work out in real life? In real life, I think it actually does a great job. As far as getting to those ratings, a lot of times they require you to be able to handhold shots at just incredibly low shutter speeds. And frankly, as far as I go personally, I rarely get effective hand-holding shots. When you start talking getting down to close to a second shutter speed, I don't care what lens it is and what IS system it is, I don't get consistently good results at that. And frankly, I don't actually see a lot of applications for shooting with shutter speeds that low. On a far more practical level, this is a real-world example that happened just yesterday. I had this combination along, and at the church that I pastor, I was honoring some of my staff, and so my wife grabbed this to take a photo of my assistant pastor and I, and not paying any attention to the settings, and it was actually on ISO 100, and of course in an indoor setting, so the shot ended up metering at 1/10 of a second. And so under normal circumstances, that would have been a blurry mess. But the effective combination of image stabilization meant that I actually had a crisp, sharp end result, which is fortunate. I wouldn't recommend doing that all the time because if there's any kind of movement of your subject, obviously that motion blur, there's no IS system that can stop movement of your subject. And so we were kind of fortunate, but it does illustrate how effective that IS system was. And so there may be shots like that get saved. Beyond that, as you can see from this video clip, it obviously makes a huge difference in capturing video. This is at 200 millimeters, and you can see that when IS goes off, it starts shaking all over the place. And so obviously it is very, very effective with video work as well. And so I can see a lot of practical applications for that. So it is an effective IS system. It's also very manually in operation. There's no whirring or buzzing that you hear. It's very quiet in operation, not like the first 70-200mm F2.8L LIS, the first one to have stabilization in an their F4 lens, and that lens sounded like it had some angry hornets in the lens barrel when you had IS activated. So this is obviously a much more manually system. It works very well. Now, when it comes to autofocus, this is a USM lens, but in this case, what we've actually got is dual nano USM motors. Now, I really like nano USM where they can make it work because it is quieter and smoother. for mirrorless applications than what USM is. USM is great, that ring type USM, which Canon has used extensively in its L series lenses in times past. It's great for raw torque and speed, and it enabled them to get good results. But when you're talking about mirrorless, where you're doing maybe more video and things like that, USM isn't as good for video. It tends to not be as stable. Again, it's about high torque. It's not about smoothness. It's noisier in operation. So nano USM allows you to get a more torque than what like an STM type lens does. But it also enables you to have those positive qualities of smoother, quieter operation. And so I really like the approach here where they've utilized dual nano USM motors to achieve the speed and the torque that's necessary. This is something that I've seen well executed with some Sony lenses, for example, where with linear motors I've seen dual, I've seen even triple and quad linear motors used in various lenses from different manufacturers. And so I think that it's an effective solution that gives you that speed that you want for a lens like this, but some of those other admirable qualities. So in this case, what we have got is a really fast, effective autofocus system that focuses near instantaneously in a variety of lighting conditions, even in not great lighting conditions, but it does a great job of focus paired with the great focus systems in these new mirrorless bodies. And so it really gets the job done on that. Let's take a quick look at focus pulls and see how smooth and quiet they are for video work. So overall, that's a very positive result. Just that tiny little bit of clicking sound that actually seems to happen as the after focus is achieved. And so I don't know if that's actually maybe somehow dispersing the kinetic energy at that point. It doesn't seem to be attached to actually driving the elements any longer. But bottom line is that it's very, very quiet, even if you're using the standard onboard mic in a very quiet environment. And so I think really positive things there. I also was very impressed when it came to tracking results. And obviously, finally, we have camera bodies in the EOS R5 and R6 that allow you to have enough buffer depth and real burst rates to be able to do tracking. And as you can see from these sequences, I got really great results with what I consider a challenging subject. Our little dog is very fast. She's also very dark around the eyes. That makes eye detect more difficult because there's less contrast in that area. Despite that challenge, however, I got really effective results. I felt like I got a little bit better, more consistent results when using mechanical versus electronic shutter, but that could also be a little bit of that variance in that I believe you get a slightly higher bit rate of images with mechanical versus electronic, from what I understand. And I actually did notice a minor difference in image quality between the two standards. But either way, I got really effective tracking results. And so end of the day is that I give high marks to the actual nano USM motors here and the focus system that we're working with in the 70-200. So let's talk about image quality, and we're going to take a deep dive here and take a look at how this particular lens performs in real-world operation. So let's start off at the 70mm end, looking at our distortion and vignette. As you can see, there is a bit of barrel distortion here, and we'll take a look at how much it takes to correct in just a second. Vignette at 70mm F2.8 is really fairly mild. We'll take a closer look at what I did to manually correct. Now obviously, if you just use a profile, either in camera or it's enabling the profile here in your whatever your post-processing software is, it actually cleans everything up easily because it's mild. But I like to show a manual correction just so you can actually see what it takes to correct. In this case, we have got a +4 to eliminate the barrel distortion, so again, fairly mild. And then also fairly mild with the vignette, a +41, and moving the midpoint all the way to the left. Cleared everything up with, I believe, a nice even end result. Now, 200mm vignette is obviously much more extreme, and then we've switched to a very mild amount of pincushion distortion. Now again, the standard profile would clean things up just fine, but to get it manually, I
input a -4, so basically the inverse of the barrel distortion on the telephoto end, and that corrects things nice and easily. In this case, I had to jack up the vignette, significantly higher, another, stop and a half to a +70. Slid the midpoint all the way to the left to give us a more even, kind of linear end result, and I think the final cleanup is fairly good. So in neither case are you really going to have any major concerns. Either in-camera profiles or just using a standard profile is going to deal with these issues. Nothing really to talk about there. So let's take a look at our resolution here. And so in this case, I'm using the 45 megapixel EOS R5 to test sharpness. I did want to throw up a point of comparison because I do want to make a point. And that is, here we have the Tamron 70-280 millimeters mounted on a 42 megapixel A7R Mark III. And so, just as, the market has gotten much more competitive. And so this obviously is the superior lens on a lot of levels, but it's not necessarily the superior lens when it comes to optical performance. And so here we can see both of them at 70 millimeters f2.8. You can see that the Tamron is clearly giving a higher contrast, sharper end result there in the center of the frame. As we move to the mid frame, the Canon is much more competitive. It's not necessarily sharper, but it looks quite good. If we move down into the corners, however, the Canon is just left in the dust by the superior optical performance of the Tamron at 70 millimeters. In either corner, we get the same kind of result. And so, it's not the sharper lens, even though the Tamron is less than half the price. So we can see stopping down to f4 does start to give us a little bit of improvement in the corner. The mid frame already looked good. It now looks fantastic. And the center, you can see that the contrast level has popped way up, and thus our sharpness is better. So if you're looking at center and mid frame, it's fantastically sharp at f4, but the corners are disappointing. Stopping on down to f5.6 helps our corners to start to look better, more reasonable, and going on to f8 allows them to finally look, I would say, reasonably good now. And so obviously, if you're wanting to shoot sharpness across the frame, f8 is a good choice. Let's give you a look. Here's an f8 scene, nice and flat, obviously, in terms of the plane of focus, so that's going to help. So we can see in the center of the frame at a 1:1 pixel level that everything is fantastically sharp. As we move off towards the edge, it remains very close to as sharp with equal amounts of contrast. A little bit softer here on the right side by comparison, but overall we have a really nice result. Lots of resolution there. Again, a 45 megapixel shot. And so a lot of detail and resolution to draw from. Now in this case, minimum aperture is f32, so really small. Let's see how it compares to wide open aperture. Even at a 1:1 pixel level, you can see that diffraction from a higher resolution body is really softening up image quality. And so I don't, there's probably applications for this. Maybe for you, the only place it looks better is actually in the corner because it's so soft to begin with, wide open there. But beyond that, I would recommend staying away from minimum aperture unless absolutely necessary. One final thing to point out is there is a very mild amount, but there is a little bit there of lateral chromatic aberration at 70 millimeters. You can see just a little bit of purple and green fringing on either side of the transition of the black to the white bars there. So if we move on to 100 millimeters, we see we're actually a little bit softer here to start off. We've lost a little bit of resolution and contrast here, and so not as crisp in the text. Stopping down to f4 is going to improve that contrast and resolution a bit. Mid-frame continues to be, I think, a real strength for the lens. You can see that it actually looks better in my eye at mid-frame than it did in the center of the frame. Looks quite excellent at f4, stop down. In this case also we see that the corners start to sharpen up considerably faster. They're not as bad at f2.8. By f4 starting to look fairly good. By f5.6 the corner performance is now looking excellent. And by f8 it looks exceptionally good right out to the edge of the frame.
At 135 millimeters, we actually have what looks like the strongest wide open performance that I've seen thus far. Center of the frame looks really great at f2.8. It looks even better at f4 with higher contrast. Mid-frame relative to the center is a little less impressive at f2.8, but as we can see by f4, it's looking exceptional. Once again, corners leave me a little underwhelmed here. You can see that the sharpness profile has really been optimized for, the middle, say 2/3 of the frame, which is fine. I think that that's probably the right approach here, but obviously it makes the corners look a little less impressive because they're not really optimized for performance there. At f5.6, you can see that corner performance is definitely improving. And once again, by f8, we have, an exceptional sharpness profile. And so Canon essentially has optimized this lens for, giving your best in the center or right off center. Actually, I think right off center is where it's optimized for, kind of more of maybe the rule of thirds for maybe portrait work. And so then if you want corner sharpness, you need to stop down. And I think that's a practical approach to designing a lens like this. So at 200 millimeters, I did want to just go back for a moment and compare. Obviously, it's only 180 millimeters on the Tamron, but I just wanted to give you another point of comparison. So this is not in a vacuum. So at 180 millimeters, we can see that the Tamron, once again, is just a little bit sharper, a little bit better contrast in the center of the frame. It's not by a wide margin, but it definitely is, noticeably a little bit better. Mid-frame area is where I think the Canon has been optimized for, and I would say it's a little bit better than the Tamron in the mid-frame. Corners, once again, are where the Canon is softest, and the difference between the two lenses is dramatic in the corner of the frame. If I move up into the upper corner, you can see the same is true there. Just the Tamron is just so much sharper and just has an overall better performance there in the corner of the frame. So we can see if we stop down that definitely resolution has started to pick up, contrast has improved, and if we move to the mid-frame looks exceptionally good. I mean, I'm really impressed with the Canon's performance there. Moving into the upper corner shows a definite improvement by f4, starting to look better there. f5.6 looks a little bit better, but it still could use some boost. And we see at f8 it's better. Let's pop down to that bottom corner, and you can see here that the bottom corner actually looks better. Bottom corner is looking quite good by comparison. And so, once again, f8 seems to be your optimal zone if you want to get sharpness across the frame. Now at 70 millimeters, we can see that while we did have some issue with a bit of lateral chromatic aberration, longitudinal chromatic aberration is not a problem. Our plane of focus contrast looks pretty good, and you can see basically no purple fringing before, basically no green fringing after. At 200 millimeters, we see a little bit more evidence of longitudinal chromatic aberration, a little bit of purple fringing before, a little bit more pronounced green fringing after the plane of focus. And so longitudinal chromatic aberration becomes an issue as you go deeper into the telephoto, less so at the wider end of the zoom range. So here we have our minimum focus distance and thus maximum magnification. And so you can see we've got a nice amount of magnification here, but you can see that, the contrast is a little bit lower. Stopping down to f4 definitely improves close-up image performance. And of course, since you're at 200 millimeters, I would think that your depth of field is going to be so small already that f4 is probably a better choice there anyway. So obviously portraits are going to be a big part of the, kind of purpose of this particular lens, and so a few headshots here. And so here at f4 we can see focus is accurate on the eyes. We can see that skin detail looks good. Overall a good result. I definitely recommend in a studio setting going to f4 or smaller, just because depth of field gets a little bit too small in most cases otherwise. Case in point here at f2.8, you can see that you really, although the eye is accurately focused, you can see that already the eyelash is, depth of field is too shallow for that to be fully in focus. And so you end up with very little of the facial features fully in focus. And so again, I recommend just stopping down a bit to get a better end result if you're in a, kind of a studio setting.
Now, if we move out of doors, the calculus changes a little bit. For one thing, you're wanting to, often get a full body. You want your background to, still be diffused. And so in that case, f2.8 is still useful. This is 200mm f2.8. I actually wasn't wowed in this particular portrait session with how great sharpness was. Shooting at f2.8, I just felt like, it left me wanting a little bit more. And of course, your mileage may vary. I mean, very few people are going to be looking at portraits, at a pixel level, looking more at the whole, and the whole looks fine. I'm just, from a technical level, I'm not wowed by a wide open performance there. Now for this shot, I stopped down to f4 because I was a little bit closer, 124mm, and you can see that detail looks better here, and I would rather start from this kind of basis and work with it, if I wanted to remove a little bit of sharpness, but overall I'm happier with that end result, and the background to me still looks nicely defocused. Here's 200mm, and at f4 you can see that the bokeh still looks very nice. Bokeh highlights look good here, and in terms of overall our sharpness is good. Not like wow, off the charts good, but I think it's good enough for portrait use, and so overall I'm happy with the look of the image. Here's a casual, shot out just walking with my wife in the woods, and so around 160mm f2.8. You can see that globally contrast looks nice here, and again, I'm not wowed at the pixel level of everything, but overall the image looks great, and so I think that most people would be really happy with that end result. Out on one of my hikes, this is 200mm f2.8, and I think that image looks pretty great there. I think it's right in the sweet spot in terms of composition, just slightly off center, and there I get optimal performance from the lens, at least this particular copy. Now, interestingly, I switched into APS-C mode, and so, obviously you have a lot more magnification when looking at it on a global level. If you zoom into a pixel level, you don't. Obviously, you're just cropping down the amount of pixels. However, there's plenty of sharpness there to where the image still looks obviously nice and sharp at a pixel level. And so, obviously, it's useful, particularly if you want to crop kind of in camera. Go into APS-C mode, this lens does just fine with. Now, while I'm not necessarily, overly wowed by sharpness from the lens, I think it's fine. I think it's competitive. I don't think it is, I don't think that it's advanced the ball in any kind of way. But I am really pleased with, for a zoom lens, with the quality of the bokeh. And that's the thing that's really kind of stood out to me the most, that it creates a really nice, kind of pleasing blur in a lot of situations. It creates just the way it kind of generates colors in the background, I think looks great. And this is an image that I have cooled a little bit to kind of suit the look, but sharpness looks good here. This has actually been downsampled for sharing to social media, so sharpness looks a little bit better at a pixel level because I've downsampled it some from the original resolution. But you can see that it kind of bleeds off towards defocus really nice. This image I think is beautiful, just very, very soft background blur. Also here it's a little bit busier of background, but I feel like it's handled the various layers really, really nice. And so I do want to end on a note of kind of high praise when it comes to the overall rendering from the lens, which I think is operating at a higher level than what maybe it achieves on a technical pixel level.
And so, I found that the image quality actually out of the lens to be good, but not what I would consider exceptional. I think that the bar has really been raised in recent years, and there's been a lot of fresh challenges from third parties, for example, and we saw the Tamron as an illustration there, to where they're delivering really, really high-end results. Often not quite as feature-rich or as nicely built as these first-party lenses, but of course, I will also point out that this Canon lens is more than twice as much as what that Tamron lens. Now, that Tamron lens isn't available for the RF platform, though I do sincerely hope that both Sigma and Tamron do port over some of the lenses that they've developed for Sony mirrorless to Canon RF, and I certainly think that there is room for it there. If the bar has been raised here as far as this lens, I think it's more in the complete package and its convenience and portability, not so much in the image quality, which I don't think is actually improved over what we saw in the the EF versions of this particular lens. And of course, you're also more limited in that you can't use a teleconverter, whereas I found that the L Mark II and L Mark III lenses did really well with teleconverters in terms of holding good image quality. And so I would say, as far as a trade-off there, I would say you're actually getting a little bit less rather than more in this particular lens. But I will say, I think that the rendering is really great from this lens. If Canon has raised the bar, I think it's in the global look of the images, not in the technical details so much. I have found, as a conclusion on this lens, that its size and its portability make it what I would consider a rather indispensable lens. And I'm definitely considering one for use for events, for weddings, for things like that, and for general purpose shooting. It's just so versatile in terms of the focal length and the aperture, great image stabilization, but of course the form factor, it makes it really attractive in a way that no previous 70-200 lens has to me. But I also believe that the price at $2,700 US makes this a lens that is just going to be out of the reach of a lot of potential customers. And so I definitely think that the RF mount needs alternatives. And I think that one of those alternatives that we'll almost certainly see will be from Canon. And that will be a 70-200 f4, LIS type lens, which has been a great option for Canon in times past. It's smaller, it's lighter, but often performs at a very, very high level. We need a lens like that, that's priced at roughly half the price of this. And then, of course, I do sincerely hope we also see third-party development in the future that gives some options for those that simply, this is a great lens on a lot of levels, but it's just not affordable for many, and perhaps for many that are watching this video at this point. And so I think that there's certainly room for alternatives. However, right now, if you want, kind of the indispensable lens to pair with something like a 24-70mm, this is obviously your guy, and I suspect we'll see this lens on a lot of Canon mirrorless cameras, on sidelines, in portrait photographers, wedding photographers, because it does a lot of things very well. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full written review, also to an image gallery if you want to check out some of those photos that flew by here. Beyond that, of course, there's also linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, or to sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.